This guy is our former colleague at KGO and a great voice and political analyst across the CBS television stations and across iHeart Radio. Uses him as their political guy as well. He is ours on Monday for a few minutes. How about it for Gary Dietrich, everybody? Hi, Gary.
Hey, Mark.
So, give me a damage report or a post-mortem on that Madison Square Garden event as far as Trump is concerned. Give me damage report and then political help or damage.
Well, Mark, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head. I heard your intro here before I jumped on with you. And, there's no getting around the fact that, is this sort of part of Trump world, some of this craziness? Yes. Is that baked into Trump's perspective and people's perception of him? Yes. Do I think Trump and his people need to do a far better job of vetting their own intros? Absolutely yes, right? I mean, I just think some of that stuff was just completely off the wall. And yet, that's the comma, and yet, to your point, 34, I mean, I use the same phrase sometimes, 34 million views of that Rogan thing, that ain't nothing. And I think the important thing out of this election cycle that's going to be very interesting to me, you go back a couple decades and you remember before online donations, people were like, wow, all of a sudden people can give online. Remember what a big deal that was? And Barack Obama, all of a sudden shot up tens of millions of dollars overnight. People were like, wow, how does that? I think we may be in the same kind of tipping point when it comes to the impact of things like podcasting, right? I mean, we're going to find out after this election because there'll be a lot of postmortems. Hey, what influenced your vote? And, it's going to be interesting to see how many people say, yeah, well, I listened to, Rogan, or I listened to that, or, the Taylor Swift endorsement. That was a big deal, and all the tweeting. I mean, the social media stuff, to me, may be the most singular, interesting aspect from a political science perspective out of this election cycle. How much impact did it have, or is it having, relative to the so-called traditional mainstream media? And I think this is also going to spill over into another thing, Mark, and that is there'll be a lot of people in this country who have no idea who Joe Rogan is, right? They literally have no idea. But to his tens of millions of people that have subscribed to him, he is a big deal, right? And I'm just wondering down the road here, how much, say, a Barack and Michelle Obama, how much a Bill Clinton is going to impact this election vis-a-vis a Joe Rogan?
Yeah, this is what I was saying before. I felt as though, and still feel, that Kamala Harris should have done Joe Rogan. I don't understand what she was afraid of. I mean, it is a weird bro-down, fraternity-like thing at Joe Rogan. He does a lot of that. But Howard Stern has a lot of stuff that you might go, nah, you might be a little, certainly old school Stern is really, radioactive in some ways. And sort of to what you're saying, these new platforms may represent opportunities. And I think because they're new and there might be some stink on them because of some of, prior guests that have shown up, there might be reluctance to actually get into an environment like that. But wow, Gary, I mean, I find Rogan to be, in essence, a pretty easy interview for most political people or, even problematic figures. He's not too tough. The toughest questions he'll ask are like the sort of, I was about to say everyman questions, like just like the obvious, like, well, can you give me an example of that? Like that's an everyman question. Like it doesn't require, and that's all he did with Trump. And then Trump goes for 3 hours, of course, no problem. I feel like Kamala Harris could have gotten something out of it. Although, as you keep saying, and then I'll stop talking, I guess I'm just sharing some random thoughts. It's all baked in maybe at this point, isn't it?
Well, I don't know how baked it is in total. I was referring specifically to some of those off-the-wall comments said by others at Madison Square Garden yesterday.
Sure.
The other thing I think interesting about that was the timing. I'm sure they, with basketball season and anything else, that probably Madison Square Garden pretty booked up. But I thought, interesting that I'm sure some of this junk, Mark, got lost in the NFL yesterday. Seriously. The highest rated programming forever and ever, amen, the NFL probably just overshadowed some of this stuff. There's another part about this I think that's interesting, and that is, you know, how tough is a Rogan? You make a really good point. How tough is a Rogan vis-a-vis, say, for example, Brett Baer with Kamala Harris? He was pretty tough, right? Would Rogan have been tougher on her than Baer? I hate to say, probably not, probably not. Or look at the other side, look at Vance yesterday on the Sunday morning shows, getting beat up by CBS and ABC and some others. I mean, I'm thinking that in some ways, some of these online platforms people think are radioactive, but in some ways, they might be easier for candidates than the traditional mainstream media thinks. So I think there's going to be a real postmortem on this. And of course, for Kamala Harris, the biggest challenge is going to be if she does lose this, that one of the things that's going to come out, and it's been talked about through this entire cycle that she's been the nominee, was her getting on the media bandwagon late, that she didn't jump on some of these exposure opportunities earlier enough. That certainly is going to be one of the critiques that's offered.
Yeah, it's true. And it's funny that now that you've mentioned this, I kind of skip ahead in the movie to that as well. I think, and at the time I felt, honestly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. She was surging so much early, Gary, that I felt, and I think I've even mentioned in this exact way to you, that the people who wanted her to sit down for interviews, the people who do sit down interviews for a living, those are and that's the media. So that's what you were hearing, this chorus from the media, like she hasn't done any sit down interviews, but she was surging so effectively, so well. I mean, it was just like, why not ride the horse in the direction it's running? Now you get into the rugby scrum of the last 10 days, or less than a week, or about a week, and maybe there is something to like a Joe Rogan last minute push. I love what you said about Brett Baer. The Brett Baer thing was, I felt that was throwing a bone to the right to go in there. I mean, there's sort of like, she doesn't do any tough interviews. Meanwhile, Trump was just doing rallies and these back rub interviews. Essentially, the toughest things he did were, I think, it was in front of the Detroit Economic Club and also the Chicago Economic Club. That wasn't tough. It was just that he made it tough because he said that stuff about tariffs. So I think she would be surprised at how well a Joe Rogan interview would go. Hey, play Gary some of the Michelle Obama stuff, just because I wanted to at least not neglect it completely. Although I feel as though after what Gary just said, it kind of probably was lost in the wash. But Michelle Obama, you can see it there in the rundown, Tony. She was, she's so effective as a speaker. She's so very, very good. But it's a question of, when that tree falls in the forest, is it heard? Go ahead, play me a little Michelle Obama, if you would, please, Tony. Kim was very big on this, and I think she's right. I think she's right that Michelle Obama is so strong. Go ahead. This is over this past weekend. So this is, if you will, at the same time that the MAGA folk are, at Madison Square Garden, and as Gary says, there are football games going on, et cetera. Here was Michelle Obama showing up for Kamala Harris.
Who love us. Let me just try to paint a picture of what it will feel like if America, the wealthiest nation on earth, keeps revoking basic care from its women, and how it will affect every single woman in your life. Your girlfriend could be the one in legal jeopardy if she needs a pill from out of state or overseas, or if she has to travel across state lines because the local clinic closed up. Your wife or mother could be the ones at higher risk of dying from undiagnosed cervical cancer because they have no access to regular gynecological care. Your daughter could be the one too terrified to call the doctor if she's bleeding during an unexpected pregnancy. Your niece could be the one miscarrying in her bathtub after the hospital turned her away. And this will not just affect women, it will affect you and your sons. The devastating consequences of teen pregnancy won't just be borne by young girls, but also by the young men who are the fathers. They too will have their dreams of going to college. Their entire future is totally upended by an unwanted pregnancy. If you and your partner are expecting a child, you will be right by her side at the checkups, terrified if her blood pressure is too high, or if there's an issue with the placenta, or if the ultrasound shows that the embryo was implanted in the wrong place, and the doctors aren't sure that they can intervene to keep the woman you love safe. If your wife is shivering and bleeding on the operating room table during a routine delivery gone bad, her pressure dropping as she loses more and more blood, or some unforeseen infection spreads and her doctors aren't sure if they can act, you will be the one praying that it's not too late. You will be the one pleading for somebody, anybody, to do something. And then there is the tragic but very real possibility that in the worst case scenario, you just might be the one holding flowers at the funeral.
Okay, so that's enough. You get a sense for it. I mean, it's pretty gruesome stuff. You can see how she's an effective spokesperson. That's a particularly uncomfortable kind of run to listen to. But that said, I'm wondering if it doesn't cut through on some level.
I think it does. Here's my thing about the Obamas. I wonder if they weren't rolled out a little late. I sort of feel like, this election, one of the things I think we're hearing now, Mark, from voters, you're even hearing it from people in the media, people are over it. You know what I mean? I just think there's a fatigue factor, so much rhetoric. This campaign has gone on so long with so many twists and turns. I kept saying, hey, when are we going to see the Obamas? When is Michelle and Barack? I just sort of feel like this last week, 10 days, I mean, if I was advising the Harris campaign, I would have brought them out a couple weeks earlier, where they are a little bit less just sort of in the midst of the final barrage of everything. You know what I mean? Because now is when you have the last House race ads, the last Senate race ads, the big closing arguments like Madison Square Garden. And I don't know, I know they were bringing them out to kind of do the close. They were to be the closers. But I just am wondering, again, on a big NFL weekend, college football weekend, I just feel like you have to be sort of sensitive to the cultural milieu. And I would have probably brought them on stage a little bit earlier to try to get some of those people over the finish line. Again, the last point I'd make on that, Mark, is, there's a quarter of the country that's already voted. A third of the country almost that's already voted. So, that's sort of my take on that. She certainly is an effective communicator, of course, as is her husband, Barack.
Our campaigns go on way too long to begin with, Gary. You know that's true. My God, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, in Britain, you don't have this crap. You know what I mean? It's 0 to 60 pretty quickly. This is from Underdog. In the 2020 election, Joe Biden secured Pennsylvania by a margin of 81,000 votes, with a vibrant population of 600,000 Latinos and 300,000 Puerto Ricans in the state. And I'll continue the rest of this and just say, might the remarks of this past weekend have any effect on the Pennsylvania outcome?
Yeah, well, they certainly could. We don't know how that's going to resonate. I know the Trump campaign's trying to walk some of that stuff back. I certainly don't think it helped them. I mean, I think that was just those comments. I mean, to use Donald Trump's own word, it was stupid. I mean, there's just no other way to put it around. I don't know how it helps you. Let's put it that way. I mean, let's be honest about it. So, in the margins, we hear 10,000, 20,000 Puerto Ricans say, that was it. I couldn't pull the trigger for Trump on that. Could be. I mean, I don't really know. It's going to be interesting to see where a lot of these individual communities, likewise, Mark, one we haven't touched on yet, I'll just mention briefly, where is the Arab American community going to come down after the Israeli attack on Iran and its neighbors this weekend? I mean, there's some wild cards out there that is that going to negatively impact, Kamala Harris, who was on the Situation Room call with Biden when that attack from Israel went down. I mean, there's some niche group voters like Arab Americans, and I don't call them niche in a derogatory way. I just mean in terms of, segmented voters, voting blocks that people are paying much more attention to now. Whoever talked about, a tipping point for Arab American voters in the past? To my knowledge, nobody. And yet in this election, particularly in Michigan, they could have substantial impact. And perhaps the Puerto Rican vote or Latino vote in Pennsylvania likewise.
It's such a good point about the Arab community. I never thought about it really much before, that it hasn't been talked about in past elections as so critical in this critical swing state of Michigan. I wanted to play a little bit of the Rogan stuff, which I believe Kim has in there, don't you, Kim? There's I wanted to play it for Gary. You'll find it. And if you can't locate it, tell me what you've got up, and we'll roll with what you've got up, Tony. Whatever's easy. We had so much set aside for you, Gary, that I wanted your take on that. I'll kind of take anything off the table, but you let me know what you've got, Tony, and I'll run with it. But this. So we've identified two things so far at minimum in this conversation. One of which is the new media environment that all of these candidates are operating in, and how maybe in the case of Kamala Harris, she's given up some of the advantages of that media environment, like for the Joe Rogan sit down, for example, because she, or her people, sort of presume a negative that may not really be there in the way that she thinks. Also, the power of Trump actually doing it. It may have been more powerful than any kind of MSG rally, meeting the tens of millions of people virtually that you meet through a platform like that. Here is a little bit of Trump on Joe Rogan.
I have a theory that these pollsters, they charge you a lot of money too. They charge you $500,000 to do some stupid poll, and they interview like 251 people. I don't think they interview them in many cases. I don't want to get myself in too much trouble.
You think it's bullshit?
I think that's the way Trump would do it.
They sit there, they make a deal, they get $500,000, and they say, Trump's leading 51-49. They announce it, and everybody says, oh. Do you understand? I think in a lot. Look, I'm a very common sense person. I think that they probably don't always poll. Some of them probably never poll. What's the difference between 49-51 and 47.5?
Well, it's also a tiny percentage of the population. I don't think it's representative of the overall population. I just don't think
I don't know
is.
of one person in my whole life that ever got called by a pollster.
Exactly.
No, I've been called by pollsters 3 different times, so I know that it does get out there. But I also know that if Trump was a pollster, that's exactly how he would do it. He'd take the money and just make up the poll numbers, and then that would be the end of it. You can just see his mind working so obviously. So that's a bit of Trump on Joe Rogan. We have more, don't we, Tony? No? Do we? Kim? Anybody? Anybody still with me? I wanted to share with Gary, I thought that
I think we have the part where he's questioning Joe Rogan is talking and asking for examples about the presidential loss. Did he really lose? And that was kind of an interesting part. The whole Joe Rogan interview was very it was just more of a conversation, but he was allowed to lie unchecked throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about the fact that it's really not a tough environment. It wouldn't be tough for Kamala Harris either, I don't think, unless he got together with his bros who would say, ask her about this and don't let her off the hook on that. But I think in general, Rogan is fairly accommodating to his guests. I have a couple of things, Tony, if you're having trouble finding it, I can tell you where it is.
I want to talk about 2020 because you said over and over again that you were robbed in 2020.
Yeah, totally.
How do you think you were robbed? Everybody always cuts you off. I'm going to allow.
Well, they not only cut you off. Well, what I'd rather do is we'll do it another time, and I would bring in papers that you would not believe. So many different papers. That election was so crooked. It was the most crooked election.
Okay, but give me some examples of how.
Well, let's start on the top and the easy ones.
Okay.
They were supposed to get legislative approval to do the things they did, and they didn't get it. In many cases, they didn't get it.
What things?
Anything.
Legislative approval
like for extensions of the voting, for voting earlier, for this, for all different things. By law, they had to get legislative approvals. You don't have to go any further than that. If you take a look at Wisconsin, they virtually admitted that the election was rigged, robbed, and stolen. They wouldn't give access in certain areas to the ballots because the ballots weren't signed. They weren't originals. We could go into this stuff. We could go into the ballots, or we could go into the overall. I'll give you another one.
Are you going to present this ever? Do you think
let me just give you one more before. 51 intelligence agents come up that the laptop was from Russia. It turned out to be totally false.
51 former intelligence agents, right?
They say that made I don't believe it's this much, but it doesn't have to. I lost by I didn't lose, but they say I lost, Joe. They say I lost by 22,000 votes. That's like 0.1%, less than that. It's a tiny little thing. 22,000 votes spread over this period. So 51 intelligence agents lied. They lied. They lied. They knew it was. It was Hunter's. It was from his bed. It was Hunter's laptop. They said it was created by Russia. Russia. It was the Russia hoax. The Russia hoax was a big hoax. It was all a big hoax. So
well, that's clear. That's one example. But that is a good example.
That's a big example. They say it made a 17-point difference. That's a big example. But that's only one. And you could go into the ballots where they wouldn't give you access to the ballots. You could go into the ballot harvesting. You could go into $500 million for the lock boxes.
But just in terms of narrative, so there's two things, right? There's the Russia hoax. There's the collusion with Russia that was never proven, right? That's one.
Well, no, it was proven it didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
But they talked about it on television.
But it took 2.5 years to prove.
But not only that, but it was a constant narrative on television. So
Sure.
that's a constant narrative that gets into people's minds, especially low information people that just watch the news,
Sure.
that you're in collusion with Russia. So that's one.
Sure.
So that changes the narrative. And then you have the 51 former intelligence agents that work with the original Twitter and get them to remove links. You can't share it on DMs. You cannot share that story. They swept that story because they said it was Russian disinformation, even though they knew it was not.
100%.
So that's two examples that are real examples. Now, anyone who considers himself a legitimate, objective observer of American politics, if you really want the best person to win, you would want people to not lie. And the only reason why they got away with this lie was because they continually labeled you as this horrible threat to democracy and Hitler.
Yeah.
They kept saying you're going to be a dictator, ignoring the fact that you weren't a dictator for the 4
Correct.
years where you were actually the president.
I was actually the opposite of a dictator. I was a very straight guy. But look, those three things, you take those three things, each one of them by themselves causes the result to be different. Okay?
It does.
And then you can go into 100 other things. There's so many.
Okay, thank you. It goes on. You see, first of all, how honestly, there's something weirdly transfixing about watching Trump just spin like this. He just spins these completely invented facts. Then you think to yourself, well, wait a minute, but that's kind of tied to a fact. I think I know what he's saying. For example, they wouldn't give us access to the ballots. That was when it was really a rebel group under the MAGA flag wanted to go in, and they did get access to those voting machines. They actually, it was quite the incident. You can Google it and read about it, those of you watching. The not matching signatures and everything, these are all Republican things, throwing people off the generally disenfranchisement of voters is the kind of thing that was happening in North Carolina and Georgia, et cetera. So, Gary, as you watch that riff, you can see how Rogan, though, because he is very conspiracy theory friendly, he wants to sort of ride to the rescue of Trump. He's helping Trump along in that exchange, I thought. Didn't you feel that?
Well, I thought it was kind of a mixed bag. When he got into saying, I agree with you about this, I agree with you about that.
Yeah,
Early on, the follow-up questions I thought were pretty good. So give me an example. Tell me, okay, fine. But tell me, are you going to bring this information out? So I thought he did pretty well early in the first half of that. In the second half of it, maybe agreed with it more. Mark, here's my thing about all of that. And this is the thing that I think is going to be really interesting. Again, when all the exit interviews are done, why did you cast your ballot? When I listen to Trump recite that, and frankly, when I listen to the other side go back 4 years and recite that, I just really have large wonderings, let me just say that, about how much that really moves the needle. I think this has been said so many times in so many different ways, in so many platforms. I think the hardcore Republicans, they're going to agree with Trump. The people that are anti-Trumpers, they think that's just a whole bunch of lies. The 15% that are going to decide this election, I think their eyes glaze over with most of this. I really do. And it was interesting to me in the last week to hear Trump say, yeah, well, I may go ahead and, if I win, I may go ahead and just pardon Hunter Biden anyway. What? I mean, Hunter Biden left. I only say what? I only say what because, wait a minute, bro. The Hunter Biden laptop has been one of your big things for years, and you might just pardon. But see, to me, that is what you see in traditional politics, right? It's like, oh, well, that was then, this is now. And I think that is very much an American political mindset. Turn the page. We're going to be it's going to be a new day. I really have serious doubts, Mark, how much recitations about 2020 are still informing voters' decisions. I don't see it in the polls. I don't see it in the focus groups. I mean, are they concerned generally about the state of our democracy? Yeah, but you have those concerns when you look at the polls and the focus groups. They're with both sides. So I really don't know how much all of this, is it important? Yes. Is it moving voters' decision-making process? I just don't see a lot of evidence for that.
Interesting. You're right. The polls show that people are over 2020 and that whole stolen election thing. I thought maybe you're right to break it up into two categories. The category of helping Trump didn't come until the latter part of what we just saw. The first part, where he said, well, can you give me an example of that? Or are you going to present this at any point? And Trump was like, well, there are hundreds of examples, et cetera. It was... But I think in the end, Rogan is in Trump's corner, of course. Primarily, I think, informed by the anti-vax thing, when the anti-vax movement got associated with Trump somehow, and MAGAs. There are a lot of anti-vaxxers in that world, which is weird, too, because, Trump began the vax development. So it's just an odd thing. But so, Gary, with just, I think we'll have one more visit before Election Day with you. Anything to watch for? Is there anything that can change much at this 11th hour? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, I'm going to touch on two important things we haven't touched on yet, and I can do it real quick because we've talked about them in the past. Senate races, House races, okay? So all the stuff happening here at the top of the ticket, people ought to remember, that stuff affects the down ticket. I mean, it affects it in terms of turnout. I mean, if you can generate 10,000 more people to turn out for the top of the ticket, you can guarantee that in most of these House and Senate races, you're going to get half of those people at least say, okay, well, yeah, I think I'll vote for the Republican or the Democrat or in this too. That can have a big effect. I mean, right now, not only is the presidential race absolutely razor-thin margin, but, tightening margins in states people didn't even expect, like Texas, like Nebraska, where Republicans have some risk at losing those two seats, and in the House, it's almost evenly divided, Mark, in terms of how many House seats Democrats want to flip, how many House seats Republicans think they have a good chance of flipping. I mean, this isn't just about the presidency. Whoever wins the White House, if they lose one of those two houses, it's going to make their life a whole lot harder in terms of doing or getting anything done. And conversely, if one of the people, one of the parties that is able to salvage one of those two houses and doesn't win the White House, they are going to have a major lever of power at their disposal to put huge brakes on whatever agenda the first 100 days that opposing candidate in the White House thinks they're going to, put forward.
Wow. And you're being asked, of course, I don't think you have the answer to this, but Phineas says, did Gary Dietrich offer his prediction for the presidential race?
I never shy away from doing so when it makes sense to do so. Right now, seriously, Mark, I had a lady last week grab my arm while I was going out of a donut shop. Okay, tell me, Gary, who's going to win? I didn't know her from Jane, right? I didn't know her from Jane. And then I kind of demurred, well, it's hard to, oh, come on, don't be PC. Tell me who's going to listen. Listen, it has nothing to do with being.
Yeah, he lost him. But I'm going to tell your audience now, and then boom, he falls out. It's great. Gary's segment is generously brought to us by Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. If you're relocating into or from Northern California, you need a highly respected real estate professional. Bill Campbell is that real estate professional. Reach him at RE/MAX Gold. Again, Bill Campbell. You can text him at 530-448-7474. 530-448-7474. He's the reason that we can see Gary Dietrich every week. So appreciate you, Bill Campbell, and RE/MAX Gold. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.